You're falling behind, Clancy.
Tiffany's voice held a hint of playful mockery as she sprinted ahead of Rob and Clancy. Despite being a big fan of hiking and being in a relatively good shape, Rob could never hope to match Tiffany's enthusiasm when it came to exploring the mountains. His forehead had long covered in sweat before she even seemed to show signs of slowing down. All he could do was push himself a little more to try and keep up. Clancy had a little more difficulties doing that, but maybe his party lifestyle had everything to do with that. Rob turned his head around to stare at his buddy and couldn't help but laugh hard at this sight. His breath was short and heavy, his panting rivaling the crunch of the leaves and fallen sticks beneath their feet. Even Rob had to admit that Clancy looked like he was about to pass out. His face was beet red, and the arch of his brows suggested that he was in great pain. Nonetheless, Clancy, just like Rob, wasn't a quitter. He would make it to the spot Tiffany would choose to settle the camp without a single complaint. Rob teased, and Clancy spat his lungs out, or so it appeared as such.
Fuck off, Rob.
Clancy managed to rasp out his reply, but he definitely took the offered hand to climb the last step. The group finally reached the plateau, and Clancy all but kneeled on the ground, one hand on his chest.
I think I'm going to die.
Both Rob and Tiffany burst into laughter as their melodramatic friend coughed and panted like a heavy smoking madman trying to find his breath. After a couple of minutes of wheezing, Clancy was good to stand up again and joined his friends at the edge of the plateau. The sight they were given was a reprieve for their sore bodies. From their standing point, they could see the forest and the trail they had followed to get there. The sound of the river, all the more powerful now that they were high enough and unbothered by the many trees that blocked the sound. In the distance, their hometown, and a bunch of black, gray, and dark-colored roofs. Rob felt like he was standing on top of the world, even though he knew they weren't even halfway to the top. He turned around to gaze at Tiffany, and his eyes followed the length of her figure absent-mindedly. He trailed them down the perfect curve of her nose, and then to the softness of her full lips, before she turned back and looked at him with a conspicuous grin. His heart tightened in his chest, and he felt fire rise in his cheeks. But he could, fortunately, still pass it as a rush of blood from the efforts it took hiking this mountain. Tiffany smiled again and pointed towards a small, barely visible trail on their left. It seemed like it was leading to the river that followed their trail. It would be good to remember in case they got lost. They just needed to follow the river.
What are you doing, you slackers? Let's continue hiking up this mountain, shall we?
Clancy's voice came as a surprise, but not as much as his arms wrapping around Rob and Tiffany's shoulders. He planted a kiss on her cheek, and when he tried to give one to Rob, he was quick to pull away with a resounding, "Don't even try, Clancy." And so, Rob and his group started hiking again, following the trail that would lead them a little further up the mountain. Since there were far fewer trees, the sound of the river easily reached their ears. It was reassuring. Combined with the fresh air and Tiffany's sight ahead of them, Rob thought this was probably a pre-taste of paradise. The sun was slowly setting down, and the time to find a camp was drawing nearer. Rob exchanged a look with Clancy before finally telling Tiffany they needed to stop. As he was about to speak, though, Rob was interrupted by Tiffany's surprise.
Wait, what's that?
Rob's brows knitted together, and he quickly climbed the rest of the way to look at the direction Tiffany was looking and pointing at. Tiffany was pointing at the mountain's flank, and what looked like a heavy iron door. It wasn't much more than 60 feet ahead or so, and should it not have been autumn, The tree leaves would have kept it well hidden from sight. It was true that this mountain wasn't exactly popular for hiking, but it was the nearest and most affordable one close to where Rob and his friends lived. He couldn't even remember anyone telling him they had gotten halfway to the top, and their group was already far past that. Usually, this mountain was good for pot-smoking teens who were looking for an escape from their parents' watchful gaze. Needless to say, they never really got past the first plateau, and Rob was at the third one with his friends. Moving past Tiffany, Rob gestured to Clancy and her to follow him. He dropped his backpack at this plateau, knowing it was the perfect spot to settle down once they would be done exploring that mysterious door. It took a little under 4 minutes to reach, considering there are no trails leading up to it. Rob dragged his feet through the forest, branches and dead leaves cracking beneath his boots. He could hear the sound of his friend's steps behind him, and once he was out of the forested area and facing the door, he had to admit he was astonished. The iron had long rusted, and there was a strange, barely visible sign in the middle of the door. Most of it had been erased by years of weather. But once Rob dusted off the door, he could clearly discover a few letters beneath it. Government property. Authorized personnel only. It looked like something straight out of a Resident Evil movie, and Rob half expected a zombie to slam against the door any minute. The temperature outside was slowly decreasing as the sun glowed its last few minutes on the horizon, and a cold breeze brushed against his face, and Rob realized that his sweaty body and that coldness were a recipe for sickness. Looking at Clancy, he saw the same thing in his eyes that he had felt. A desire to know more about what lied beyond that door. As for Tiffany, she seemed pretty on the fence about it, her lips sealed in a thin line.
It's getting late. We should unpack our tents before total darkness. And eat. Because food is good.
A silent nod of agreement was given, and the trio returned to the plateau after working their way through the small forest again. 30 minutes later, the tents had been raised and a fire was crackling, not too far, so they could cook their meals. Rob used his pocket knife to carve a few sticks for him and his friends to use, while Clancy got the food out of his backpack. Nothing ever beat hot dogs over a fire with calcinated marshmallows for dessert. Giving a quick look to Tiffany, Rob gave a stick to Clancy before moving to sit by Tiffany on the log. He gave her a stick and cracked a grin, the flames of the fire reflecting on his eyes. And he watched her intently for a few seconds, and she watched back, before Clancy interrupted them with a pack of sausage. They each took out a few out of the pack and stabbed their meal and watched it burn in the fire. Clancy fetched the buns from his bag, took a couple for himself, and threw the bag at Rob, whose gaze had wandered back to Tiffany. Unbeknownst to Rob, Clancy was staring at them both pretty hard. When Rob finally felt his friend's gaze on him, he quickly rose from his seat and walked back to Clancy, a little bit apologetic. Sorry, bro. You know how it is, she's just so damn perfect.
Yeah, I know.
Clancy's tone was dry and knowing. Rob looked at him spitefully, biting through his hot dog, his gaze moving between Clancy and Tiffany. What? You two? And no words came from Clancy's lips. only a harsh glare as he finished his hot dog and threw the remaining of his bun into the fire. Rob turned his attention to the flames and watched as they crackled, sparks jumping out of the fire and close to their feet every now and then. He could hear crickets singing in the woods nearby, as well as some other insects he wouldn't know how to identify. The silence felt heavy for some reason, and Tiffany's yawn was enough for Rob to turn his gaze to the sky. It was late. The blanket of stars had already covered the darkness, and the moon was rising. Cold seeped into his bones, and he rubbed his exposed arms, regretting that he hadn't taken a vest for the evening. Maybe it was time to retire into his tent and let sleep beckon him into dreamland. Part of Rob didn't like leaving Clancy alone, especially after their short discussion, or lack thereof. But gritting his teeth, his arms closed around his frame, and he exhaled heavily, his breath making a white fog as it hit the fresh air of the night.
Just go to bed, you twit. I'll take care of the fire. I'm not tired yet.
Clancy replied as he gave him a playful shove. And though he wasn't entirely reassured, Rob nodded in approval. They could always talk more extensively about Tiffany later. He was still a little bit unsettled about learning that Clancy liked Tiffany too, his mind debating whether or not he should pursue her or not, at the risk of losing a friend. Rob entered his tent and got under his sleeping bag as thoughts of Tiffany burned behind his eyelids, each scene painted with the atmospheric music of the forest. The rustle of the leaves with each breeze finally lulled him to sleep, and the exhaustion of the hike allowed him to sleep soundly for the next 7 hours. Rob awoke to the sound of scratching next to his tent, and the shadow of what he thought was a big raccoon could be seen through the fabric of his tent. Rob tapped the side of his tent as he scared off the animal, surprised at the sound of it running away. It didn't sound like a raccoon dashing away. It sounded like something being dragged across the ground, the leaves and branches cracking under heavy weight. A groggy groan escaped his lips, and he put that auditive hallucination on the fact that he had just woken up, convinced that it couldn't be anything else but a squirrel or a raccoon searching for food. A few minutes later, and half-dressed, Rob made his way out of the tent. As he put some distance between the camp and himself for some privacy, he saw the trail that led back to the river, and then looked back at the metal door. After taking care of his morning business, Rob returned to camp, only to find that Clancy was half in Tiffany's tent. It left a sour taste in his mouth, but Rob made his way to his friend anyway. "Hey, what's up?"
She's not there.
Rob's heart stopped as Clancy got out, looking a little distressed. "What do you mean she's not in there? I just woke up a few minutes ago and I thought you two were still sleeping."
I woke up because I heard you. Then I thought I would wake her up for breakfast, but she isn't there. All her stuff is still in the tent, but it's like she vanished.
Rob felt a pressure on his chest and rapidly walked towards the trail, calling her name. It was unlikely that she would hear them because of the noise of the river, but it was worth a try. Both Clancy and Rob yelled her name for a few minutes before meeting back at the camp.
You think she would leave without telling us?
Clancy asked, obviously puzzled as to why she had disappeared without a trace. Passing a hand on his forehead and through his hair, Rob negated that option. She wouldn't have left her stuff behind. His head rolled on his shoulders as he stared left and right, trying to figure out where she had gone. It's at this moment that his gaze is pulled towards the heavy, rusty iron door. not too far from their camp. Without a word, he started walking towards it, the sound of Clancy's footsteps following behind. A crow sank its tune in the distance as Rob finally reached the door, his hand already going for the round handle. Clancy's hand gripped his wrist before he could turn it. The handle looked like one of those old submarine doors, which only added to the mystery of what it was doing on the mountain. When Rob looked back at Clancy, the man was nodding negatively and looked a little bit afraid. Rolling his eyes, Rob shook out of his grip and started turning the gear-like handle, hearing it creak due to years of abandon.
We shouldn't.
She's gone. I can't see where else she would be. Are you coming in or not? It might be harsh, but he had a hard time thinking of where Tiffany could have gone. She probably was as curious as him, given how adventurous she was by nature. Clancy knew that too, so he would come to his senses. Or not. Rob would feel a lot safer if he was there, but he wouldn't admit that he was chicken shit enough to not go alone. After a few seconds of thinking, Clancy finally agreed to go with him. Rob grabbed the handle of the big metal door, and surprisingly, easy enough, it opened. A wave of mold and airless space assaulted his nostrils, and it reminded him of his grandfather's basement, in that one room that was never opened. He had made the mistake of going in once, and the smell of mold and mildew was so strong it never left his memory. And this place was similar, except there was something humid and chemical about this place as well, like an old hospital would smell if it was left alone for quite some time. Clancy hesitated, and Rob took the opportunity to climb down the few steps. It was as dark as the night inside, and the walls were entirely made of iron. They felt cold to the touch, and he could feel the bolt where the metal panels met each other. He wondered if he could find something to light this place up.
I'll go get our flashlights. Don't go too far,
Clancy said from the top of the stairs as he ran back to the camp. Rob decided to keep following the wall until he would be at the bottom of the staircase. As his foot reached the floor, his hand caught what he thought was a light switch. He flipped it up, and an array of yellowish lights turned on at once, giving dim lighting to what looked like a long corridor. Some of the lights were flashing, and a light buzzing noise filled the air. Rob decided it was likely a generator, because there was no way this place still had electricity after being left to dust for so long. A huge slam behind him made his heart leap out of his chest, but it was only Clancy returning with the flashlights. He had dropped one, and since everything was made of iron, the noise of it hitting the ground combined with the echo had been more scary than necessary. And a few seconds later, the flashlight rolled down the flight of stairs, each step it hit making a loud, banging noise as well. 10 steps later, in a good fright, Clancy finally looked at Rob in confusion. Yet there was a switch. Rob didn't know how else to explain, and Clancy just shook his head. As Clancy got down the flight of stairs, Rob picked up the flashlight from the ground and shoved it in his pockets, ready to explore this place further. The first thing they had to do was to explore the seemingly unending iron corridor. After a few seconds of walking, Rob realized it was only because of the angle that it had looked like it had no end and other passages. Every now and then, they crossed a new hallway on their left or their right, some of which weren't lighted at all. It was understandable, though. Some lights might not have survived the years, and Rob wondered briefly how long this place had been left alone. The deeper they were getting, the stronger the smell of chemicals and mold. It was strange, considering that iron shouldn't be able to mold, which let Rob believe there was more than these metallic hallways to this place. Taking a right, he felt Clancy's hand on his shoulder, as if stopping him from going further. Sure, this place seemed huge, but Rob trusted his memory to be able to bring him back to the main hallway. Anyway, he figured they couldn't stay lost in here long enough, that it would be dangerous for them. Shrugging out of Clancy's grip and directing a frown at his friend, Rob took a step forward in the hallway, and an irritated sigh escaped his lips, but he managed to stifle most of it as he clenched his jaw. In the new hallway, there was some development. There were huge metallic doors and thick glass windows revealing what looked like research compartments. Some of them still had papers all over the desk. Some still had vials with strange liquids. It explained the smell of chemical in the mold. Rob continued to advance forward and reached another enclosed area behind heavy glass, which was filled with empty cages. Some of these had bones in them, and he could only pity the poor animal that most likely died of hunger while trapped in this place. Clancy's hand dropped on his shoulder again, but in his attentive examination of the cage, he had completely forgotten about his friend's presence. Rob jumped and turned around to look at Clancy, who was pale as a ghost. "What the fuck, dude?"
We should go. There's something weird about this place.
"Yeah, you know what? There's something weird about you. Just go if you're that chicken shit. I don't need you. Tiffany's down here. I just know it." Rob felt more irritated than necessary, but he was tired of Clancy acting like a coward. When he wasn't grumbling about Tiffany, he was acting like a goddamn child in the face of adventure. Even Tiffany had more balls than him. It seemed to work like a charm because Clancy's brows knitted together and he sighed heavily, showing his resignation. And for a moment, Rob thought it was impossible a man like that could ever end up with a woman like Tiffany. She was too good for him. Rolling his eyes, he gave one lasting glance to the empty cages before stepping further into the hallway. The buzzing noise he had heard when turning the lights on became a lot louder in the silence. Since Clancy was done complaining and Rob didn't have anything to tell him, they just continued to walk down the hallway until they met another crossroad. Left or right? The left one wasn't lit, and the lights were flickering on the right. Nonetheless, for visibility, it was better to go to the one that was still lit up. As Rob was about to turn right, he looked down and saw footprints in the dust on the ground, and a strange scratching noise. It was a dull but constant, like claws trying to tear away iron. A series of 3, repeated every few seconds. His curiosity piqued, and Rob decided to go left instead. He barely heard the "Oh, come on," escaping Clancy's lips as he took the left and walked in complete darkness for a few seconds. The scent of chemicals was ever so present and seemingly getting stronger the deeper he got into the hallway. Or maybe it was because he was deprived of sight that his sense of smell detected it more strongly. Rob parted his lips to breathe with his mouth instead, but he had to close it after a few seconds. It felt like dust was gathering on his tongue, and he was getting dizzier. The cold metal of the wall against his palm kept leading his steps forward, to the scratching sound. Clancy coughed behind him, so he knew he wasn't alone. A warm puff of air brushed against his left cheek, and Rob thought that Clancy was pulling a prank on him. "Clancy, stop that."
I'm not doing anything.
Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe there was a vent releasing hot air or something. But they were getting closer to the scratching noise. Tired of walking in the dark, Rob fetched his flashlight, and the scratching stopped. "Clancy, did you hear that?" No response. Rob turned on the flashlight, his gaze narrowing as the light burned his retina. When his eyes adjusted to the light, about half a second later, Rob dropped the flashlight in a panic. In the dark, he had seen the skeleton of a man hung from the ceiling, his rib cage scratching at the nearest wall as it dangled. The warm air came from a ceiling fan, which had probably turned on when Rob flipped the switch. Turning around, Rob dashed out of the hallway and back into the light in far less time it took to get there. He had not only lost his flashlight, but Clancy was missing as well. His heart felt like it was about to burst. Feeling like his heart was rising in the back of his throat, Rob leaned against the cold wall for a few seconds before calling out for his buddy. "Clancy, where the fuck are you? Fucking coward. Did you really leave me alone in here?" He should have expected it. The man had always been a coward. It wasn't like he was going to prove him wrong in the dark basement. What a cheap friend, leaving him alone without so much a goodbye. An anger brewed inside Rob, twisting his stomach with unprecedented ire. He swallowed his bile and walked towards the right, where he should have gone from the beginning. As he entered the lit hallway, he heard the same sound he had heard next to his tent in the morning. Something was dragging against the floor behind him, still hidden by the darkness of the hallway on the left. Something wet and disgusting. Something was peering at him with eyes that he couldn't see. Rob's hair stood on end, and he walked faster in the light and deeper into the research complex, his mind starting to get dizzy. His eyes were burning, and his heart was still perching high in the back of his throat. He took a left, and then a right, then another right before he couldn't run anymore. His heart hammering in his chest and his head pounding something fierce. Stuck at a crossroad again, he had the choice between two hallways on the left, one on the right, or one in front of him, none of which were lit, much to his dismay. He regretted leaving the flashlight behind. Rob considered turning around and walking back from where he came from, by only taking the hallways that were lit. But when he turned around, he realized that the hallway he had taken to get to that point had been plunged into complete darkness. Standing in the only visible lit space, Rob felt his forehead covering in a sheen of sweat. He passed a hand on his face and remembered he still had that pocket knife. It wasn't much to defend himself, but it would be enough should he encounter anything dangerous. Because there was definitely something down there. Inhaling deeply, Rob's breath was stolen from his lungs as his eyes laid upon multiple eyes staring at him from the darkness of the hallway in front of him. A gross, slimy tendril appeared in the light, and Rob had to blink twice to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. The closer the thing got to the light, the more Rob could make out of its silhouette. It was about the same size of a man, but it was nothing but bone and fluids. It dripped like oil on the floor, and its eyes shone bright like the moon in the dark sky. Its irises, like two flames burning atop of candles. A rush of adrenaline and a cold shiver forced Rob to move, and he ran in the opposite direction as he heard the grotesque, skeletal monster rush after him. A disgusting sound of its slimy body dragging itself across the floor after him, haunting his steps. Rob screamed at the top of his lungs as he took a left and slammed his foot into a metal box lying on the floor. He felt the heat of the vent, and when he looked up, he was back next to the hanging skeleton. In his fright, he still thought about his flashlight and tried to find it, to no avail. Another scream was ripped from his lips as he heard the beast getting closer, so he got up on his feet and ran as fast as he could on a sprained ankle. The pain radiated through his steps as he tried to dash through the many hallways, soon losing count of how many turns he had taken. Where were the lights? Why wasn't his flashlight on the floor where he dropped it? His body tensed as he heard a loud, shrill scream, and it came from the beast behind him, the one that still dashed after him. Rob ran faster on his throbbing ankle. He needed to think quick. He needed to hide. He wasn't going to die in that basement. He needed to find a place where he could lock himself in. And it's at this moment that Rob found his way back to the cages, but the creature was on his heels. He couldn't make it to the doors, so he quickly entered the first research room he found, closed the door, and pushed everything he could find to block it. On the other side of the glass, the creature was licking the window with its body, leaving a trail of dark goo that was staining the window. Rob realized soon enough that the fumes oozing out of the glass were actually vapor caused by the glass melting. The monster was trying to get to him, using some sort of acid body to burn its way through the glass. He was stuck. He had signed his death by locking himself in that room. Looking around, he slid his hands on the walls until he found a switch and flipped it. Light filled the room and the hallway, and the beast disappeared momentarily. Was it afraid of the light? With his hand clasped tight on his chest, Rob reached for the pocket knife with the other. Once he had it secured in his grip, he walked toward the bay window and couldn't find it. So he moved the stuff he used to lock the door away and then opened it. It was his chance. Now, if he could just dash back to the main hallway, he could get out the door, and he would be safe and sound again. Swallowing thickly, he returned to the hallway. Thankful that it was lit again, Rob advanced towards the main part of the hallway, disgruntled to find it plunged in darkness yet again. If he remembered correctly, it was only a 4-minute walk, maybe one if he ran all the way to the door. He stepped into the darkness and heard nothing. So he took another step forward, and suddenly, something grabbed his ankle and wrapped around it. The pain from the strain combined with the grip of that strange tentacle soon became too much, and Rob fell on the floor to his knees. His knees took the hit pretty roughly, and he spat some bile as a weight crashed on his back. When he looked over his shoulder, all he could see were the needle-like teeth of the monster, and its fiery eyes gazing down at him. One of the creature's tendrils caressed his hair in a mock gesture, and Rob screamed, his body squirming under the slimy creature until he was able to face it again. Using all of his courage and his pocket knife, Rob stabbed the creature repeatedly, feeling its disgusting slime ooze over him. His shirt stuck to his skin as he kept stabbing and stabbing, showing no signs of stopping anytime soon. As the creature weakened, Rob managed to push it off, and he kept stabbing it until gurgles and weak growls were all he could hear. And he finally stabbed it again to make sure it was dead, and then he planted the knife in one of its eyes. Filled with adrenaline and out of breath, Rob found the strength to get up and dash to the exit. Rob threw the door open, and he fell against the cold, hard ground of the forest. He coughed for a few seconds before realizing that the door wasn't shut, so he stood up quickly and slammed it closed, making sure that any monster hiding in there would stay in there. His chest heaved something fierce, and the fresh air combined with the sun made him feel sick. Rob's body slid against the door until his ass was on the ground and his eyes turned up to the blue sky. How long had he been in there? A wave of queasiness hit him, and he threw up on his pants. As he went to wipe off his mouth, he noticed his hands were covered in what he thought could only be the creature's blood. The sound of the river soon replaced the buzzing noise from the basement, and Rob weakly got up to his feet. It's on shaky legs that he walked past the camp and then to the river. The shock was etched high on his features as he saw Tiffany swimming in the river, and he remembered why he and Clancy had gone in the mountain door to begin with. To search for her. Dizzy and disoriented, Rob took a few steps forward until the sound of his feet against the gravel alerted her to his presence. Tiffany got out of the water and glared at him warily.
What's with all the blood? Are you hurt?
Rob couldn't answer, his lips sealed as he looked down at the state of him. His shirt was drenched in blood. He was pale as a ghost, and his brain was still hazy.
Rob, where's Clancy?